Welcome back to the not the director's commentary. I didn't work on this line. It's just a fan commentary on the Star Wars modern action figures because while I've made a lot of toys, I never worked on Star Wars Basic 3 and 3/4. And at this point in the line, we're starting to finally get a little deep. We've gone from orange to green cards, and we've had quite a few figures at this point. Okay, this image doesn't quite do this moment in time justice because there's some figures here we haven't gotten to yet, but coming up soon. The point is, the line was here to stay. And while the first offerings were very focused on major characters, major ships, the most recognizable, because honestly, people didn't know if it would work. The movie was old and not in theaters at this point. And we'd really just been getting our toes wet, if you will, in the expansive universe that is, the potential for Star Wars action figures. With so many hundreds and thousands of characters to do, by this time in the line, very few. But this was the wave that was going to change that. It was like going from sticking your foot in the water to taking a giant cannonball and splashing out half the pool. And this wave very much was a game changer and one that kind of broke a lot of the rules that had been established. For example, all of the waves that had shipped so far were all themed for one movie. And at this time we only had 3 movies, unless of course you count the Caravan of Courage, but we're not going there. Classic trilogy here, people. So this wave, very different, because now, for the first time, we were getting a wave with a mix of characters from all 3 movies. And it was a big indicator of what the future of the brand was like, the future of the line. And as I said, this wave was a real game changer, because it really showed how the line was aimed at both kids who liked, funny-looking aliens, but as well as collectors who had very specific characters that they really wanted to see that had been beloved. So with that, let's jump into what was the best wave yet. And we're kicking that off, as kind of foreshadowed by that previous image, with our favorite Mon Calamari himself, Admiral Ackbar. Okay, no offense to those who like the guy from Rogue One. So this was Admiral Ackbar's second ever figure, unless of course you count the rubber one from Top Toys, not Top Toys, but the bendy figure from the 80s. I don't count that. It's not an action figure. It's a play feature figure. So Ackbar was back with 5 points of articulation and a weird kind of oversized comlink blaster Mon Calamari thing. To this day, I still don't know what that is he's carrying around, but it definitely beats the stick that his vintage figure came with. Although the stick was probably more accurate to his character, being an admiral who gives, plans and, attack plans to the troops and, sitting in his chair. I always wondered why we never got his chair. Well, we did eventually get an even better Ackbar figure in the Vintage series, but that was years away. And this Power of the Force 2 Ackbar was our definitive Ackbar for well over a decade. All right, moving along, and we got a lot of figures to cover in this wave. Dengar, one of America's favorite bounty hunters. Well, we all love all the bounty hunters, don't we? And being able to collect all of them in the modern line as well as the classic line was kind of like, completing a team. And that's one of the fun things about action figure collecting, is having a full set. And the bounty hunters do make a set. And at this point in Power of the Force 2 in the modern line, we had only had 2. We had Boba Fett and we had IG-88. We had Fett in his Empire outfit and in his Jedi outfit. Well, Dengar was making his modern figure debut, but it's not quite the Dengar that you were asking for or thinking of, because he is not in his Empire Strikes Back outfit. Namely, he doesn't have this, his backpack with a tire on it and a hubcap. I mean, they used all sorts of funky things like, even ice cream makers in the original trilogy as spacey kind of props. Whatever it was that made up his backpack, this iconic element of the figure was missing, and he was sans backpack with a flat armored back, if you will. So a lot of fans just kind of thought this was maybe, cutting costs, and they really remembered him, standing next to IG-88 on the Devastator, waiting for orders from Vader, and well, that's because this is not Dengar from Empire. It's him from Return of the Jedi. I know you're like, what? What are you talking about? What do you mean Dengar from Return of the Jedi? Dengar is not in Return of the Jedi. He's one of the bounty hunters from Empire Strikes Back. Everyone knows that. Well, there are some bounty hunters in Jabba's palace. You probably have seen Bossk because he's right next to Boba Fett in a couple of crisp shots. But if you have careful eyes and you circle and darken the other areas, he's there. Dengar is in Jabba's palace walking around. In fact, you can see him clearly without his backpack. And this is the big change from Empire to his Jedi look. So the figure that we got in Power of the Force 2 is our first and still only Return of the Jedi version of Dengar. Perfect for your Jabba's Palace dioramas. So while the vintage figure is fondly remembered from being his Empire look and came complete with his blaster rifle and backpack and tissues wrapped around his head, well, even though we all remember the backpack from kids, this new figure was missing it. And a lot of people found this, well, some people didn't even notice, but for, the fans that did, a lot didn't realize that this was based on the Return of the Jedi look. Eventually, we did get an Empire version. Actually, we got two. We got one first in the Gold Saga series, and then we kind of got our definitive Dengar released a few years later as the first wave in the Vintage collection, which was released for the 25th of Empire, I believe. So we had a lot of Empire Strikes Back figures come out in that first wave, including what's pretty much our definitive Dengar, at least our definitive Empire Strikes Back Dengar with backpack. But yeah, if you want a Return of the Jedi one, you only have the Power of the Force 2 version to go to. And while it definitely, irked some fans to get this version, looking back, it's really cool that we got it because it's a different Dengar and one we haven't gotten again. All right, speaking of bounty hunters, next up we have our second ever Four-Lom figure and first ever Four-Lom figure correctly labeled as Four-Lom. Did you know Four-Lom means for, love, or money? Yep, that's because, he's a bounty hunter. All right, some people say love of money, but it's love or money. All right, I know, how can a droid love money? You'll notice that vintage figure, their names were swapped. Him and Four-Lom and Zuckuss here were infamously in the vintage line with reversed names because, back then there was no one really paying attention to this kind of stuff. Heck, you had characters named Hammerhead and Snaggletooth. So, go figure that Four-Lom and Zuckuss were going to get their names flipped around. And even though they are partners, this whole name thing was going to forever be attached to their action figure destiny. So fans really wanted not only a update to Four-Lom, which we got, with more detail, including the gold and the red kind of scar that's across his shoulder, but one that's actually called Four-Lom on package. As for Zuckuss, he wasn't going to be long behind his partner, but he would have to wait a few more waves in Power of the Force 2. But again, when we did get him, he would actually be the first Zuckuss figure with his correct name. So, don't Zuckuss to be Zuckuss no more. The vintage figure was a little bit of a retool of C-3PO in gray. It didn't quite capture that rust color that the prop had in the movie. You can see here side by side how kind of different they are and how much the highlights in the rust color really make him pop and look very much like a unique droid and not just kind of a bootleg C-3PO. A definitive Four-Lom eventually would get released in the 30th anniversary line, and then the same figure with no changes whatsoever would get re-released in the Vintage series, which is interesting because usually when they go in the Vintage series, they get some kind of paint upgrade, but he was good enough as is. There really was no reason to upgrade him. But for over a decade, much like Ackbar back there, this would be our definitive Four-Lom. Next up in this amazing multi-movie wave is Garindan, the spy from Mos Eisley. And note that he's called Garindan, and then in parentheses, Long Snoot. And this was interesting because, one, I never heard him called Long Snoot ever, but, while some people kind of thought he was like the poor man's Darth Vader because of the similar shape of the cape, he had nothing to do with him. He was the guy who ratted on the rebels in Mos Eisley, telling the stormtroopers where to find them. And while this species, or character species, has shown up a few other places, he's been in The Mandalorian, actually in the pilot to The Mandalorian, he's in the very first episode, this member of the Kimbidi homeworld and the Kabaz species I always wondered if that was his mask or is that actually his skin, but from what I can tell, yeah, that's actually the way they look. He just has goggles on. And it's a very toyetic figure. No wonder he shows up so much in action figure form. And one of those figures that kind of felt like it should have been probably in the vintage line, since he has quite a bit of screen time, especially compared to someone like, Snaggletooth, that's pretty much not in the movie. This was also our very first figure from the streets of Mos Eisley. We'd had some Cantina aliens in the terms of Ponda Baba and Moma Nadone and Greedo, but Long Snoot here, as called on package, was not in the Cantina. He was just hanging out on the streets. And I assume Long Snoot is sort of, an homage to what Kenner, quote-unquote, might have called him had he been in the vintage line. Again, like Walrus Man or, Hammerhead. Interesting note is he was voiced in the movie by none other than John Wayne himself. Yep, Bible truth. It was actually John Wayne's very last film role before he passed, was providing the voice of Garindan. Ironically, his grandson was not going to provide the voice, but was actually going to be the actor inside the suit for The Mandalorian. Go figure. All right, one other last quick thing to point out is he was our first figure to come with a comlink. Granted, it was sculpted in his hand, but it was pretty cool to get a figure that actually came with a comlink, since they're used so much in the movies. We did get an update of him later on in the Saga collection, never in the vintage line, but still do in that one. It was a good update. All right, speaking of Tatooine, Mos Eisley, and all of that fun, we do go back to the Cantina for none other than Ponda Baba. And interesting, he's called Ponda Baba on package, while in the same wave, Garindan was called Long Snoot. You would think that if they were sticking to that naming convention, they would have also called him Walrus Man, since he was one of the notorious figures that was reinterpreted by Kenner due to lack of reference material when they were cranking out figures as quickly as possible in the late 70s. And, while some people think he's got a butt for a mouth, he's an Aqualish. That's his species. That's just what they look like. And it was great to finally get a version of him that was screen accurate with the tan suit and the orange jacket, as opposed to the vintage figure that's kind of in a wetsuit. And he came fully armed, not only with, his sidearm blaster, but a giant rifle as well, much like, Chewbacca and the Han Solo from the first wave. A sort of kitbash version of him with new legs and arms later came out in the Cantina Cinema Scenes pack. This was sort of a more running, charging Ponda Baba and only came with one accessory. And we'll get to him when we cover the cinema scene. But it's interesting to compare the two. It's the same figure, just with new arms and legs. And speaking of arms, while this figure is a lot more accurate and screen accurate, it's not quite. Because if you'll notice in behind-the-scenes footage and in the holiday special, and when you look closely, Ponda Baba doesn't have fingers. He has flippers. Even when his arm gets cut off and tossed to the floor, the arm that gets chopped off has a flipper at the end. In a very rare behind-the-scenes image here, you can see that. When they later did the inset shot of the arm as a pickup, he was given a wolfy, furry arm. So interesting, discrepancy. And when Ponda Baba, Walrus Man, now on package again in the vintage series, got an upgrade, he came with both types of hands. So you could interchange flippers for wolf hands, which was a neat detail because, he had one type of arm in the wide shot and another in the insert shot. So, hey, why not? And, of course, then the greatest Ponda Baba of all would be his Pez dispenser because, who doesn't want a Ponda Baba Pez dispenser? All right, next up we go from A New Hope to Return of the Jedi with our very first skiff guard and first skiff character. Another one of those sort of subsets fans like to collect. Like they collect bounty hunters and Imperial officers. A lot of fans like to collect the characters that go on the skiff. And this Weequay, who was an update of the vintage Weequay, and I should note that Weequay is not his name. Weequay is a species, so we see quite a few of these in the original trilogy, well, really only starting with Jedi, but they are kind of not all over the place in Jedi, but, we see quite a few of them in Jabba's palace and on the sail barge, and they've shown up in the prequels as well. We even had a Weequay as a Jedi, and they show up in The Mandalorian as bartenders, and, heck, even in Clone Wars and Rebels, one of the main characters is a Weequay. And not all of the characters have been made into figures. Fan customs over the years have kind of filled in some of the gaps. But we have gotten quite a few of them. And in particular, this one was very important because it was the Weequay from the vintage line. It was the only Weequay from Jabba's Palace / Sand Dune Skiff Battle of Cartoon that made it into the vintage line. And a lot of fans have been very adamant about getting all 92, 96, 122, however you want to do the count, figures in the modern line. So a great update, and notable because his arms are pre-posed to hold his vibro axe with both hands. One of the only early figures that had this. Now, we would later get a vintage collection series that had articulation in the elbows and wrists so that you could pose him holding his axe or his blaster. But significant here, because not only were we now entering the world of skiff guards, but we had a figure that could hold his axe with both hands. Although how he held his blaster, he never quite worked that way. And with the ongoing skiff toys we got, it was great to finally be able to populate them. Also to note that when this figure was re-released with the freeze frame, it's one of the rarest freeze frame cards. So if you have the freeze frame version, hey, now you can retire and enjoy that life you've always wanted. All right, Jabba's palace would not be complete without Gamorrean guards. And I say guards because, plural, there's quite a few of them. And this was also one of the most beloved figures in the vintage line because, come on, who doesn't like a green, fat, pig ogre type? I mean, he basically looks like an orc or an ogre or, a generic fantasy type. And carrying an axe definitely helped. And there were quite a few of them in Jabba's palace, so you could army build, and it was justifiable. Whether you wanted to get them to feed to the Rancor or just, guard the Rancor. It's funny how they never really made toys of Gamorrean guards getting eaten by the Rancor. Well, I guess they made like some high-end statues, but it would probably be pretty disgusting and, okay, they did make kid versions of this. Never mind. All right. Well, no matter what Rancor you have, he can munch away on his Gamorrean guard snack cakes. Or you can just have them hanging around guarding everyone, and this was a great guard to guard the guards. And really was our definitive Gamorrean for well over a decade. Seems like I've said that a lot this episode. We got a repaint of him in the original trilogy collection line that came out shortly after the prequels. But if you wanted a real definitive version, and again, there were quite a few Gamorreans, each with their own version of the axe or, pike stick, we did get a vintage series version, which is amazing, and one of the most beautiful 3 3/4 figures I think Hasbro Kenner has ever done, and came with multiple axe-type weapons. Although, to take the cake, Black Series is where you're going to get the greatest Gamorrean ever. This guy is amazing. I'm not a huge Black Series guy, but I had to get a couple Gamorreans, because I loved the Gamorrean Guard when I was a kid. He was just one of my favorites. It was annoying because he would never fit in any of the cockpits because he was too big. But that did help him out in the sense that he got to be reused in other lines. In fact, Friar Tuck here from Kenner's Robin Hood Prince of Thieves line. Yeah, don't look too closely under that cloak because there's some Gamorrean goodness under there to be had. Yep, the Robin Hood line was chock full of reuse from different Kenner lines, including Superpowers and Star Wars. So, yep, Gamorrean Guard lived on as Friar Tuck in Sherwood Forest. All right, I saved the best for last, and I did that on purpose because Grand Moff Tarkin, Willard Tarkin, I think is his first name. He got a first name eventually in the books. This was an amazing figure, and you'll notice he's even called out on package and is the first and only figure to be called out as never before offered in any Kenner collection. And that's because to many fans, this was the character that was the most, I guess you could say, missing in action in the vintage line. If there was one figure that was wanted in the vintage line that didn't make it, it was Grand Moff Tarkin. So finally getting a figure of him, this is why this wave is so meaningful, because it really showed that this line was going deep. I mean, come on, that's what I'm talking about. Oh, I can't do puns as well as memes. Anyway, the point is Tarkin really was the main bad guy. I know Darth Vader gets all the pop culture love and so much of the screen time, but come on, Tarkin's there on the poster, and he's the one who blew up the Death Star, for goodness sake. But most people in popular culture have no idea who he is. He's just that guy standing next to Vader, bossing him around. If you ask people what his name is, they'd be like, I don't know, he's Folio from Hunchback of Notre Dame, or wasn't he one of the U.S. presidents, I swear, or that guy from that Valerian comic book. Actually, he is that guy from the Valerian comic book. It's like pretty much picked up from that exactly, but that's not important right now. The point is, he never had a vintage figure, and this was a big missing hole in a lot of collectors' collection, and there's been custom versions over the years, complete with custom card backs, and we did get a retro series version released that sort of showed what he could have looked like had he been in the vintage line. This came with the Escape from the Death Star game. There you can see him in the cutout window there, as included with the game. And it was definitely a cool figure. It was cool to have a figure in the Kenner style. But since we were in the modern line, getting a figure released as part of the line with all the rest of the figures was pretty darn great. And, yeah, we never got him to hang out with the other Imperial officers as a kid. I mean, you got the black officer or black suit officer and the non-screen accurate gray suit Death Star commander. We've had a few Tarkins in the line, including comic book versions and ones based on the prequels. And while I actually like to take the comic book version head and put it on the prequel figure's body to sort of make my ultimate Tarkin, alone, these figures don't really cut it because the prequel one obviously looks a little bit too young. And we even got a vintage series version, and I so wanted this to be like the definitive Tarkin figure. I was so excited when his name was released on a list of upcoming figures. And then I saw the figure. Doing Imperial officers is tricky, but it's not that hard. And rule number 1 is don't give them cloth skirts. Why does he have a cloth skirt, and why is he wearing green camo? He does not wear green. He clearly wears gray. And I don't know, for it's supposed to be the definitive figure released on a vintage card, this figure really missed the mark for me, and I was very disappointed. And I still kind of go back to this original Power of the Force 2 release, which really still holds up. I mean, yeah, other figures have had the rubber sort of skirt piece, which looks a lot better. And, this Tarkin didn't have any skirt piece. It was just sculpted as part of the legs. You can kind of see the lines of it. But, the way his head works and the way the neckline, I don't know. Definitely wasn't buff. Oh, God. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. But yeah, at least they didn't make Tarkin buff like they did with the early Power of the Force 2 figures. It was definitely a show that they were going to commemorate really Tarkin's legacy and everything he did to reduce unemployment on Alderaan. Now, if you are going to go definitive Tarkin, you kind of have to go 6-inch because, again, much like the Gamorrean Guard, the Black Series offered a Tarkin that was just bar none amazing. Not a huge Black Series guy, but this was also a figure I had to have because it's Tarkin! It was an amazing wave. And whether you're a fan of Tarkin or you're a fan of Gamorrean Guards or Long Snoots or anyone, this was the wave that really changed things and showed that the future was really bright for modern Star Wars action figure collecting.